Welcome back to class. In the first part, we talked about how a fiscal policy or a monetary policy affect the two endogenous variables, like the interest rate and the GDP level. We learned that an increase in government spending increases the interest rate and the GDP level, while the monetary policy leads to a decrease of the interest rate and an increase in GDP. So both policies are appropriate to increase GDP. But these two analyses had in common that we were looking at fiscal policy and monetary policy in isolation. What about when we look at the interplay between monetary policy and fiscal policy? What if we talk about the interactions between monetary and fiscal policy? In this graph, we have three different scenarios. Scenario A is the government increases taxes, so implements a restrictive fiscal policy. What could be the reason that the government implements this kind of policy? It could be the case that the government budget is in red ink. There is a government budget deficit, and therefore the government would like to increase taxes to close this gap. What are the effects on GDP? We can have a look at part A. It is the case that the IS curve shifts to the left and the interest rate decreases while GDP decreases. So in the first panel, in panel A, it is the case that the economy ends up in a recession. Furthermore, it is the case that the interest rate decreases. In the second part, like in panel B, the question is asked, what happens if the central bank holds the interest rate constant? So in panel A, the interest rate decreases from A to B. What if the central bank holds the interest rate constant and the central bank has to implement a restrictive monetary policy in order to hold the interest rate constant? Therefore, the LM curve shifts to the left, and we end up in scenario B. In the second panel, like in panel B, it becomes clear that when the Federal Reserve is trying to keep the interest rate level constant, this leads to an even more severe recession. In case that the central bank is inactive, in case that the central bank does not react, we would end up in this point here, and GDP would only increase to this level. But since the central bank decreases money supply, the LM curve shifts to the left, and the recession is much more severe. So an interest rate policy in this situation doesn't seem to be appropriate. What if the Federal Reserve performs a policy in order to hold income constant? This could also be an idea. In a first step, the IS curve shifts to the left because of the fact that the government wants to close the gap in the government budget, and the central bank performs an expansionary monetary policy and increases money supply. In this situation, it is possible that the GDP is constant, that there is no recession which is taking place, because we have two effects on GDP. The first effect is negative. The government increases taxes and this leads to a recession. But the Federal Reserve is leaning against, the wind is leaning against this kind of policy and is performing an expansionary monetary policy, shifts the LM curve to the right, which leads to an expansion. So these two effects, they work in opposite direction, but they have the same size, so that in the end GDP is on the same level as before. From this graph, we can derive the insights that the impact of a fiscal policy also depends on the policy which is implemented by the Federal Reserve, which is implemented by the central bank. It depends very much on the reaction of the central bank. So whether a fiscal policy affects GDP, yes or no, and how much a fiscal policy affects GDP depends on the reaction of the central bank. It depends on whether the central bank keeps money supply constant, as was the case in panel A, or keeps the interest rate constant, which was the case in panel B, or if the central bank tries to keep income constant, which was the case in panel C of this graph. In the textbook, what follows is a case study related to the US recession of 2001. What happened in this time period? It was a case that there was a drop of the stock market because the so-called dot-com bubble bursted. Like a lot of internet companies were founded in the second part of the 1990s, stock market was on an all-time high in 2001, and suddenly the stock market plummeted. When the stock prices decrease on a larger level, it implies that the wealth is down and the private households will reduce consumption. So consumption is down, we have a goods demand shock, the autonomous component of consumption decreases, the IS curve shifts to the left. Then the attacks on 9/11. This increases the uncertainty for managers and households. We have a consumption shock and an investment shock, and this leads to a decrease of the autonomous component of consumption and a decrease of the autonomous component of investment. Then also a series of accounting scandals played a role, like the Enron scandal or the WorldCom scandal. Like two big American companies, they had to file insolvency, they went bankrupt. This, of course, depresses also the stock price and the wealth, and hence we have a consumption shock here. But these accounting scandals also led to lower investments, so that we have a shock with respect to the demand for investment goods. So we have several shocks here which affect the demand for goods negatively. The IS curve shifted to the left and the economy ended up in a recession, the recession of 2001. What were the policy responses? Like our textbook says, tax cuts. This is one idea. Cut the taxes, perform an expansionary fiscal policy. Tax cuts lead to an increase of disposable income and then will affect the demand for investment goods. Furthermore, the central bank also performed an expansionary monetary policy. An expansionary monetary policy leads to a decrease of the interest rate, and then the demand for investment goods will pick up again. So, like these policy responses, they are completely in line with our analysis so far, completely in line with our theoretical ISLM model. This is the end of the second video. I'll give you some time to digest. Have a nice day. See you later.